Welcome to Total Design Live. It's a podcast where real tabletop game designers, with a surprise set of design constraints, design a game right before your very ears. It's game design without a net, and it starts now.
Welcome, everyone, to this recap episode of the first season of Total Design Live. I'm David Abelson.
And I'm Rosco Schock. Well, we want to thank everyone for tuning in. We had a great first season, and we especially want to thank Tony, Jonathan, Ashwin, and Andrew for their time, for coming on the show and letting us push them out of their comfort zone a little bit. It was really interesting to hear their creative process, see them kind of brainstorm on the fly, and see how they each went in kind of a totally different way, even though they were given the exact same design constraints. So I thought that was really cool to see, and hopefully you listeners enjoyed that part as well. We also want to thank you listeners for joining us. This is the first season, and we're still working through some of our stuff on our audio setups and making sure that it's edited well, and we're going to keep continuing to evolve that. I think you also, if you listen to all 4 episodes, heard that we kind of like are making small tweaks as we go along, and we're going to continue to do that to try to like get to the interesting part of people kind of thinking on the fly as soon as possible, but also making sure that they have a certain level of comfort. So it's not just like design something, go, and then silence, and they don't really know how to kind of get going and get their engine turning, as it will. So we're going to keep tweaking that as we go season to season. So we're thankful you joined us this far, and hopefully you'll be around for each future season. What do you think, David?
Today, what we're going to do is we want to just recap the 4 episodes that we had in our first season. We're going to talk a little bit back and forth about what Rosco and I sort of enjoyed or found interesting about each person's design process and the things that sort of stood out to us. I think we just want to jump right into that. So let me just get started by saying our first guest on episode 1 was Tony Tran. And Rosco, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so thinking back to that episode, and after we recorded it, I was trying to think about like what was the interesting kind of moments as we were in the middle of it. The one thing that kind of stood out to me was he initially started talking a little bit and like moving vans, even storage units a little bit, and like that's kind of where his head went for home. And with the cards numbered 1 to 100, it really seemed to me that like as I was listening to him, I thought he was going to go in a certain direction that he didn't really go in, because the numbers can be used in, I think, kind of a lot of different contexts, right? They could be the weight of something, its volume, its size. A lot of times shipping and packaging stuff in there. There's things that are light but big, and small but heavy, and all that kind of stuff. So I thought at the one point that he was going to go down kind of a stacking path, meaning like you had to pack your moving van, and the numbers of the cards were like the weight. So, and that then logically to me, then you would have to put like a heavier or bigger number under a higher number. So you couldn't put a 2 down and then put a 90 on top. They have to be the other way around. But you're also still trying to like, you can only stack so high or whatever that would be. So, obviously like if that was a moving van, if the movers put all the heavy stuff on top, you're going to end up with a lot of broken stuff, and that wouldn't be very fun. And I thought the size could lead to a kind of puzzle as well, where like if the storage container or a moving van or whatever had a certain capacity, if the container only had like a maximum volume of like 130 or something, you could only put in cards that would keep you below that limit. So like maybe you have these 4 or 5 different containers, and you're taking turns adding stuff, but like you can never go over. You're trying to get rid of your big stuff first, and then players are slowly trying to like figure out how they can squeeze in like this 21 or this 30 or whatever it is before someone else drops something, and then that container's too full. And then you get points maybe for how many things you put in each container or something like that. So that's kind of like a couple of things that I thought he was going to head towards that he didn't really end up going to, and went more in a different direction. What about you, David? What was an interesting moment from that recording for you?
Well, Tony spent a lot of time in the beginning talking about a memory game. Like he wanted to make a memory game. And I thought that was going to take us in an interesting direction. There was even a spark about a game where you're organizing your game collection. One of the things that I found interesting in the beginning of Tony's process was that we got to hear about a lot of different paths that he could take, that he didn't just settle on a path early and then just take us down that path. He sort of talked about all those different things. I found the discussion about the co-ops interesting. We talked about, the idea of a co-op where you live. And we sort of explained that in the show. I thought that was interesting. But what really got me, and I was really intrigued by the idea of printing polyomino shapes on clear cards so that they can fit together and stack on top of each other in order to be part of this container thing that he wanted to talk about. I just thought that was so neat. And I thought, as you listen to Tony design, you can tell that he's done it before. You can tell that he's worked with a publisher before, and you can hear in his process that he's thinking about component quality and cost, and that's part of his thought process. So I thought that was neat. What a neat game that could be. I almost want to try working on that myself now that I can't. It's Tony's idea. But the whole clear cards with printed polyominoes on them, that sounds pretty cool. And then we rushed right into the idea of creating a life-size kind of flip and write using writing on the wall like micro macro. But then everybody playing this game right on the wall was kind of neat too. And that led to an interesting discussion and a game that came in a big tube, which definitely would not be a great idea from a publishing perspective.
Well, I think that's interesting. There's been some discussion on a different Discord about a poster as a game. So it coming in a poster tube or something where it's something you hang on the wall, but it's also a game. You take it down, and then you draw on it or whatever, and then you hang it back up. I mean, so you could go somewhere like that.
I think you could. I mean, I think there'd be some. The only thing I worry about is, there as an example. What's the name of that game that came out in a round box?
With the dice?
No, it was a board game. Nah, I can't remember. I used to have it. And so the difficulty with a game like that is it doesn't stack on your shelf real well. So now it has to have its own space. And the idea with a big tube, I would imagine, is the same problem, right? Not only does it not stack on your shelf real well, but when it does, it rolls. So
well, that's what
maybe not that.
Yeah, if you have a poster or something, then it comes in a tube, and maybe you unroll it or something. I mean, that chicken game that came out recently, it's in a weird cylinder shape that doesn't go with anything.
Yeah, I think people are trying to push the envelope on what they can do with the manufacturing process for sure.
Well, I think some of that's also it doesn't stack well, but it also is visually different on the shelf. So I think people are considering that. But,
that's true.
Yeah, that was interesting stuff. Component wise, and essentially on the product side, I think there was a lot of product things that Tony was obviously thinking about that you mentioned, and that hopefully came through in the episode. So hopefully people enjoyed Tony's take on these design constraints. But next up was in season 2, episode 2, was Jonathan Chaffer, and he definitely had he kind of jumped in on something right away. And so I'm curious, Dave, what did you think was some interesting moments in his episode?
So really, I was super intrigued by two things in the design. First, the acey-deucey style press your luck element. Guessing and turning over cards to determine the length of your move, can't stop. But then you're choosing high or low, and there's this push your luck element about how far you want to travel, and then if you don't bust, then something good's going to happen. But then on the other hand, I'll get to that in a minute. The second one was the deck building open drafting part of the game. The idea that you can have the 10 value cards. Remember, we were dealing with a deck of cards that was 1 to 100, and you can take the 10 value cards, 10, 20, 30, 40, etc., and use them as sort of the starting hand for your deck. And then you're spending the rest of the game sort of making your deck better by adding the single digit versions of those cards. I thought that mechanism I haven't seen anything like it. I think that's a really open space that really intrigued me. And I love the idea, going back to the first thing I mentioned, that the mechanism that's can't stop, it penalizes the player because you failed the challenge, but at the same time, he's added this thing so that you also get a feel-good moment because you're going to get a benefit, right? Your deck's going to get better because you failed. So I like the give and take there. That I think those were the high spots for me. What did you think?
Yeah, yeah, I thought that was interesting. When he kind of latched onto the Homeward Bound kind of concept, Homeward Bound journey stuff pretty early. He started talking about that, the AC Doocy. I was thinking, my brain immediately went to like a board. I think even something like Ticket to Ride, right? So I'm thinking these animals are somewhere, and right, it's Homeward Bound, right? They have to take the train, and they have to take all these different things to try to get back home. So I was taking that pretty literal. And so what I was thinking is that like maybe each segment on the map was like a distance, right? So it's some number, and probably like greater than 50 or whatever for a lot of them. And then maybe you had to go to certain spots to like find a different piece or a different part of the story to like get home. And so you're doing that press your luck, but you have to decide like, okay, I've gone this far, and so I'm kind of like to the next kind of checkpoint, save point, like thinking like a video game or whatever. So I can keep going, but I might bust, or I can stop and like collect, maybe some kind of bonus at each different node in the graph, right? So like maybe when I get to each one, like there's a do-over. So if I say higher and it's not higher, I can like put that in the bottom of the deck and then do one more. So I can kind of like get a do-over or mulligan kind of thing. So that's a one part that I was thinking there. And then, maybe the numbers aren't going to always work out. So there could be things where like if you get halfway and then you bust, you get to still slide forward maybe, but you don't get the bonus. Or if you don't, and maybe you have to pick the direction before you flip, or maybe it's after. I wasn't really sure, but I thought there was a lot of ways you can kind of go that way. And I could also see that, I mean, he was kind of doing the AC Doocy thing, but I thought you could also do some different parts where it was more of like a strategic game, meaning instead of it being like flip the cards high low and press your luck, what if you had a hand of cards, and like each of you, maybe it's like more like co-op or whatever, and you're each playing one of the animals, or maybe it's a race to get home. And so like you have a set of cards, and so you see what you have in your hand, and like could you get to the next node, and then you draw back up, but everyone's like, you don't know which way they're going or which way you're going. And so like, again, a little bit like the puzzle that I was talking about with Tony, where do I have numbers that'll stay, less than or close, within some range of the length of that track between St. Louis and Kansas City or whatever it is that they're going along to try to get home, if that makes sense. So it was interesting. I thought he was going to kind of go that way a little bit, but then he went a totally different way. So
Yeah, I was really hung up on the Homeward Bound idea. I thought that was really cute. So, but definitely there were different ways that he could go with it, and I thought the press your luck was a really good way to handle that because it keeps it a little bit lighter. And Homeward Bound, if you think about that, that's going to probably sort of lean in the direction of a younger audience because of the theme and the the eventual art that you're going to have on that. So maybe that was a good choice.
yeah,
Now,
and I know. Oh, sorry. I just want to say one last thing. Yeah, I know he's actively still working on it. Like he posted in Discord this week that he has made some changes. He did a play test with it in public, and he's kind of like iterating on it a little bit more. So I don't know. Maybe we'll see that in the wild someday. We'll have to see.
that's awesome. I'd love to see it. I thought it was a really interesting episode, and I was really thankful to have Jonathan on the show. And by the time we got to episode 3, we had Ashwin Kamath on the show. And what did you think about his episode?
Yeah, I thought there were a couple things that really stood out to me. So he ended up in obviously a pretty different place than he started, but I think that was really cool. But the splitting of the cards into segments, that really stuck out to me. We were going 1 to 100, and so I was thinking like, is if it's 3 segments, is it just like 3 digits? It seemed like a natural kind of like jumping off point, and I could see like each of the sections maybe being a different action. So maybe it had like numbers at the top and actions at the bottom. But obviously like 1 to 100 or 0 to 99 are kind of the same thing. So maybe it's just 2, splitting the cards in 2. And so there's 2 numbers or 2 digits and 2 actions kind of on each card. And the whole kind of like tucking over or under as you kind of build out some kind of tableau or something like that, like that's something I don't really think you see a whole lot of of that kind of like building a line of something, like a train of something. So that really like spun my brain in like a couple different directions. I have an old design that uses something similar where you overlap cards in a different way. It wasn't really numbers, but that's just something that I can't think of many games or any right off the top that like have that kind of over underlap of like multiple cards kind of like in a group. And so I think there's a lot of things you could build into that structure. I think it gives you a lot of choice, especially if you can kind of rotate the cards, be a little bit harder with the numbers, but maybe you allow that. I think there's a lot of things you can do with matching, meaning say you have a card like 39 and you have another card that's like 91. So maybe when you overlap the nines, that gives you something like that's some kind of reward or action or some other thing that you get when you like match that. And so incidentally, like when we recorded that, I was headed to the Camo Expo show, and which was a very long drive. And so like I actually designed a game specifically around that whole mechanism of like overlapping cards, underlapping. And I think there's a whole lot of like open design space around that. And I think the other thing too is it's a pretty like approachable decision space. Like, yeah, you have lots of choices if you have this handful of cards, but like you just have to overlap or underlap cards at the end, or maybe you can overlap a whole card in the middle. It's pretty straightforward what you can do, but you still have a lot of opportunities to kind of feel clever. So I thought that was an interesting thing, and he didn't really end up going that way so much, but that was like something that stood out to me. What did you take away from this episode, Dave?
This does seem like a pretty good opportunity, since you're talking about overlapping cards, for me to apologize to the designer of Honshu, because I misnamed his game in 3 of our episodes this season. Also, I want to apologize to Smirk and Dagger, because Shobu is the game that I named, and it is not Honshu. But Honshu is a game that involves numbered cards and overlapping and underlapping cards as well. So that's the one I should have named. To our audience and to the designers and publishers of those games, I apologize. But for Ashwin, his brainstorming technique was what stuck with me the most, right? I think Ashwin probably felt a little uncomfortable about this process, but the experience for me was I really felt like we got inside Ashwin's head, and we got to see exactly how Ashwin would go through the process of figuring out how he was going to get to something he could latch onto and build off of. So once he got going, he'd often just spray us with a string of ideas. I mean, it was pretty amazing listening to his brain in that way. And then like you sort of settled on, dividing the cards into 3 sections was really interesting. When he started doing it, I immediately thought about Mystic Vale. Mystic Vale, if you don't know it, is a game where they divide the cards into 3 sections, and it's a deck building game where you're actually constructing the cards in your deck by layering pieces of card on top of other pieces of card, and each of those cards is broken down into 3 sections. This was nothing like that, but that's sort of the direction I thought he was going to head. And then this was actually a multi-use card that's going to be stitched. He used the word stitched several times to another card or overlapped, which I thought you said is not really something that I've seen very much, if at all. And I think that opened up for some interesting discussion about the splaying of cards. And that was a lot of fun. It was a good episode.
I think in Mystic Vale, aren't they like partially translucent? It's been a while since that game's a little bit older, but
they are translucent. So like your base set of cards is not. All the cards that you draft are, because they lay over the top of other cards.
Right. You stack them up in the sleeves or something, if I remember correctly. And then
right.
You're kind of upgrading your card in sections as you go. And so you have like a little bit more powerful card the next time you draw that one, which is an interesting thing too. Yeah.
That is pretty cool. I think that was AEG's first card crafting game. That mechanism was that game.
It was kind of like an interesting. Our next guest and for episode 4 was Andrew Stiles, and it was actually quite interesting. We just talked about Ashwin and how his brainstorming process was really kind of like bouncing around and kind of searching for what he really liked most, like, trying to like a little bit throwing some spaghetti at the wall and seeing like what really stuck, and then coming back to it, and which is actually much more like my process. But it was a little bit different with Andrews. He kind of like settled in pretty quickly and like just stuck to one thing. What stuck out to you about his episode?
Well, besides the fact that he was super, super confident about his whole process, Like, I feel like he walked in the door ready to rock and roll and just hit the ground running and never stopped. He started taking us deep into a design concept, and I think he probably was, of the four designers that we met on this, I think he chose something that may have ended up being the deepest of all the designs, or the heaviest weight. This one might have been the heaviest game out of the four. I find it interesting that you could earn bonuses on each separate section of the building process. So he chose to do a game about building a house. That was his take on home, and so there were different components to the building process, and he thought that would be neat if you could earn a bonus if you were able to complete something first or something like that. Kind of like the winning a stage of a NASCAR race, and you even get points if you don't win the race. You still get points, so that was kind of neat. I think that was the big takeaway for me. I noticed.
It definitely was interesting, and I thought that part leaned into a little bit how like house building and that kind of stuff goes, where having bonuses or penalties for getting stuff done on time and that kind of thing are pretty typical, um, right? Because being over time, over budget, and over cost, and over whatever is always and being late, I guess, it is always something that's pretty common in almost any construction project. You think we'd be better at it by now, but that doesn't seem to be the case. One of the things that stood out to me was I thought it was like interesting when he brought up, which was in my mind kind of a different version of For Sale. So For Sale is a game that uses numbers. It's not 1 to 100, but it's in a similar space where you have these buildings and they have a different value, and you also have like essentially money you're bidding on these different cards, and you kind of draft them in lots. And so each time you draft in the first phase, like it's not like you have access to all the same value and kinds of numbers. It might be all low numbers or all high numbers. It's a little bit random. And then the second phase is you use the things that you got in the first phase, the houses you've bought essentially, and sell them. And what you get is based on this other thing of like how much money is available from essentially the customers. But again, you just have to like kind of line these things up in a sorted order. So sometimes you can get stuff for cheap, or sometimes you have to overpay. So if you haven't played For Sale and you're or yeah, if you're a designer, I think you should definitely run out and buy it. It's probably under $20, and there's a lot of great lessons for you in there. But For Sale, it does use those numbers in that way. But I could see something where what I thought he was going towards was like where the houses are coming up for an auction. So a little bit different than For Sale, where maybe you have the houses, but those houses are also playing a multi-use kind of card role where, it's a 34, but that's also maybe the bid. Think of it more of like a house swap kind of thing or something. So you're blind bidding with your cards to see if you can win a house. Maybe you're upgrading, or people don't want to give up a card that they already have. But that card that you didn't win or that you keep could also be used as a listing, right? So there's these customers, and you're putting your houses out there as listings, and the listings maybe have other attributes where like a pool or a deck or a 3-car garage or whatever the things that the customer might want, which Andrew did talk a little bit about during his process. And so like there could be set collection. You could also have kind of like secret clients that want like a special thing that but no one else knows they want that, and so you get bonus points if you can like find a house or try to get that out there. So you're kind of playing as that. He talked about the realtor angle a little bit, so that was interesting. Of like you're trying to sell the houses, but like maybe for each customer, you have to sell the house that they have, but also like get them a new house, right? And it has to be an upgrade, it has to be better. Maybe if you sell them something that doesn't match everything, you get less points. But if you can get all attributes, you get the most. You could do some kind of triangular scoring around that, or something like that. So I thought he was going to go much more on the like I said, realtor angle of it, like more on the For Sale side than the kind of builder architect angle, which he kind of seemed to went to. So that was what stood out to me.
He surprised us all. So 4 episodes, that's one season. This was season 1, and you chose the constraints. So, hey, could you tell us a little bit, Roscoe, about why you chose those constraints, or what sort of creative process led you to that?
Yeah, so I think there's not a lot of designs in this space. I personally love this constraint, especially the component one. A couple years ago at Proto ATL, I played a game by Candy Weber, and it's this set collection game, but it has a really unique market mechanic in it that uses numbers 1 to 100. And the numbers are used to manipulate what you can get from the market. And I won't go too much in detail to that because it's super clever. If you've played it, you know it's super clever. And I know she's trying to get that signed. It's been signed and unsigned a couple times, so hopefully she can get that out there because it's a really, really great game. But the thing that stood out to me about 1 to 100 is, especially at the time when I was maybe a little bit newer to design, is a deck of 100 cards is almost 2 decks, right? If we think about a 54 card deck, it kind of stuck in my head a long time ago that like having like 8 weird bonus cards or special rules or special objectives or whatever, that there's a lot of things you can do with just like 2 numbers on a card and 8 bonuses and those could be 2-sided, right? So you can get a lot of variance and a lot of gameplay in a lot of interesting ways, let me say, with just 2 decks of cards. And so I've probably designed, like I said, 10 workable playable games that use this constraint. Some are better than others. And so I was just curious to see what some other players, what some other designers might do with that constraint. It's something we don't really see a whole lot. The really interesting thing about using numbers instead of symbols is like they have like they're kind of like already multi-use, right? So you can use numbers as digits. You can use them as like, say a 2-digit number, and then you have an ordering built in, right? You have this ranking, and you can do a lot of sorting and adjusting. You get automatic like higher lower kind of things. If you replace the numbers with just 10 symbols, you lose that extra layer of kind of decision making and the ability for like players to be clever. Yeah, I think that generally is an underused space in game design, really taking advantage of all the kind of like hidden information and thought process that we have built in for numbers, right? Like it's already encoded to do a lot of things, and we don't have to teach people that 2 + 3 is 5, right? They just know that. But when you integrate that into your design, there's a lot of interesting things that could come about it. So that's kind of why I wanted to try this one for the first one and see kind of what people did. And I thought it was super interesting. And to me, again, the most interesting part was having people just be a little bit out of their comfort zone. Like, again, since this is something that's not something, it's like a worker placement one, which, people would feel a little more comfortable with. So it was cool to see everyone kind of like tackle the same constraints and go in a lot of different ways. Yeah. And be a little bit out of their comfort zone. And hopefully they feel at the end of the day that there'll eventually be some reward or some benefit from going through this exercise with us. So I guess that's all I have to say about that.
And I think that's great. I mean, I really didn't think it was going to be that deep of a reason, to be honest. But I think the fact that each one of the 4 episodes that we have in this season, and I look forward to that happening again next season, they were so unique and so different. And each designer came at it from such a different perspective that it really sort of bloomed what we expected was going to be the process. The part that we wanted to enjoy, I think, is going to be even better than we thought it was. And that's pretty exciting for me. I think that's about it for this episode. So, hey, listeners, if you want to join in any discussion about this episode, this season, or if you'd like to participate in a future season, reach out to us online at Total Design Live on either Twitter or Blue Sky. That's it for this episode, but we hope you join us again soon for more game design without a net. Until next time, I'm David.
And I'm Rosco. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Total Design Live. Be sure to check out how other designers did this season with the same surprise design constraints. We hope this podcast will help inspire you in your own board game design journey and give you a peek behind the curtain about how other designers' creative process works. Please like and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll come back and join us again for future episodes.